Welcome everybody to the June Pathways to Adult Success Solutions Forum. Today we're going to be looking at enabling underserved students to progress through post-secondary schooling and highlighting some very informative recent research on this critical topic. We are going to be hearing from Jenny Nagaoka, from the Deputy Director of the University of Chicago Consortium of School Research, on a recent report they put out called Navigating the Maze. And then from Roneeta, Guha, the Vice President for Strategy and Impact from the Linked Learning Alliance, on a recent report they've done on pathways to post-secondary, the stories of Linked Learning Alliance alumni. And together, these two reports give a very compelling recent insights into the challenges and possibilities there are for making sure that our underserved students not only get into post-secondary, but progress through it in a timely fashion and earn a degree. As always, we're going to end with an open discussion and resource sharing, and we'll have some Q&A after we hear each report as well. As usual, we have a diverse group today, so we really ask you to use the chat function to ask your questions and share resources along the way, and we really encourage you to do both. As a question arises, please put it in the chat and we will get to it in the Q&A parts. And if you have a resource that relates to what we're talking about in any way, please share that. And as always, we'll send out everything afterwards. We'll send out all the shared resources as well as a recording of the session. Okay. So just to set this up, building pathways to adult success for all and with all our students has never been so crucial, right? We know the pandemic has disrupted existing support and guidance systems and really made uncertainty the norm. And we also know from a lot of data points that momentum to and through post-secondary is being impacted, right? It's impacting the rate at which some students are going to graduate from high school. It's impacting the momentum for which kids are going from high school to post-secondary schooling or training, and it's impacting the momentum when they're in post-secondary. And we know this stems both from the challenges of COVID itself, just the impacts it's had on their health and the health of their families, its economic impacts, and also, right, sort of interesting changes in the opportunity structures short-term for young folks, right? There's actually been a surge of employment opportunities in some cases, which has given them a feeling of short-term agency in the moment, actually real agency, and actually some dollars in their pocket, which is somehow can cause challenges about their long-term planning, right? Because it's in the moment, things look pretty good, but maybe not fully recognizing that, well, you can have a good supplemental income in delivery services of all types. It's actually very hard to have a family supporting income in that. So we face all kinds of challenges in keeping the momentum going both to and through post-secondary. And we're going to really dive in today on some of the most recent findings that exist on what some of those challenges are and what some of the opportunities are for us to increase that possibility. So let's get to it. Let's start sharing some solutions. And we're going to hear first from Jenny from the University of Chicago Consortium of School Research. Jenny, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob. I'm really excited to have a chance to share this research. So it's from, as Bob and Amanda said, it's from a report that came out a few weeks ago from the Consortium and the Underserved project. So to give you a little bit of background on the project, and next slide, we, at the Consortium and the Underserved project, we've done a lot of work thinking about college outcomes, but most of the time we're thinking about when students start college and when they end. So there's been a lot that's been happening in Chicago over the past 12 years. We've seen dramatic increases in college enrollment rates. So about 12 years ago, fewer than half of high school graduates were enrolling in a 2- or 4-year college. Now that number is up to 63%, with 42% of students enrolling in a 4-year college. At the same time, we're seeing fewer than half of college enrollees completing college within 6 years. It has increased over the past 10 years or so by about 5 percentage points, but there's clearly a really big difference in the large numbers of students who are starting college versus those that complete. So one of the big questions we've had is like, what is happening in between? And so we decided to take a quantitative look at this. There's some enormous gaps. I know that Roneeta will shed some light onto some things that are happening from a qualitative perspective, but but we just wanted to sort of at least get a sense of what some of these patterns look like. So one of the first things that we saw is that there's a lot of movement between two-year colleges to four-year colleges and four-year colleges to two-year colleges. So I think kind of the traditional way we think of changing sectors is that students that start at a two-year college with the intention of going on to a four-year college, and we see that 22% of students, and these, I should mention that these are Chicago Public School graduates from 2010 to 2012. And 22% of them transferred to a four-year college at some point within 6 years after starting college. So that is happening, but it's only about a fifth of students. When we look at students who started at a four-year college, the pattern of actually going from a four-year college to a two-year college is even more common. So 29% of students from the classes of 2010 to 2012 transferred from a four-year college to a two-year college. And this is, there's a lot more that's going on here. This is not including summer enrollment, so these are just fall and spring enrollments, but there is a lot of back and forth between these two sectors. When we actually take a step back and look at where students enrolled over the course of 6 years, and this is looking at all high school graduates, 46% of students touched a four-year college at some point in time, 47% touched a two-year college, and 18% had enrolled in a two-year college and a four-year college. Most of the time, not at the same time, but these are the students who kind of move back and forth that we're looking at right here. And so next slide. Another thing that is a really common pattern is stopping out. So, taking a semester off. Quite often students are returning, but we saw that 83% of students who started at a two-year college took at least one semester off. This is like, it's actually, it's the vast majority of students starting at a two-year college leave at some point in time. And it's about half of students who started at a four-year college. So this is a really, really common pattern of taking some time off. And about half of these students do return to college. So, they may take a term off, and a lot of times, sometimes there are academic struggles, sometimes there's financial reasons, there's social reasons, there's any number of reasons why students are doing it. But the idea that students start at college and then go until they complete is really not true. The other thing too is that, half of these students are coming back. So it's not that they decided that college wasn't working out and they didn't want to complete. They are actually, taking some time off and then coming back and trying to complete again. The thing is, though, is that about almost 90% of these students are not completing a degree. And that is true of students who started at a four-year college and students who started at a two-year college. And so taking time off, there's a lot of things that is probably signaling different types of challenges that students are facing in terms of completing a degree. So a lot of them do not complete, but it isn't that they have given up on college necessarily. Okay, and then next slide. So another thing that we had wanted to do with this is just to sort of complicate the story and examine what pathways look like from when students start in college to when they complete. So here, we actually do this for four-year students who started at a four-year college, students started a two-year college, and students who didn't make an immediate transition to college. And here, we're looking at the graduates from 2010 to 2012 who started at a four-year college. And this is almost 23 CPS graduates. And then we looked at to see what their next transition looked like within 2 years. And so, like a little over about 60% of them stayed in college continuously for 2 years. 3,000 of them transferred to a two-year college, and then 5,500 of them stopped out. And then we took another look at seeing what was their next transition. So a lot of them are staying in, and then you can see here that once we kind of move out to the second transition, things start to look a lot more complicated. So students will stay in a four-year college. Sometimes they'll transfer to two-year college after 2 years. Sometimes they'll take some time off. And students are transferring from a four-year college to a two-year college. Sometimes they return to a four-year college. Sometimes they stay there and complete a certificate or an associate degree, and sometimes they just leave. The part of what we are trying to do is just to kind of show how complicated student pathways are, just why we're calling it a maze, because I think a long time ago we were talking about there being a pipeline through college, and that's clearly not true, especially when we look at something like this, and just really starting to demonstrate how complicated the pathway students are taking through college are. And then when we look at where these students were 6 years later, about half of them had completed a four-year degree. A handful of them had completed a two-year credential, so either a certificate or an associate degree. And then, a little less than half of them had not completed anything at all. So part of this was just to kind of show that, most of the time when we're talking about college outcomes, we sort of look at this first piece, and then we look at this last piece about whether or not they completed, but there's a whole lot of movement happening in between. And if we really are going to start to think about how do we better support students, how do we think about the transitions, and how do we make sure, and how do we try to reduce the number of transitions students have, we need to be understanding how complicated things really are for students. And then I also wanted to touch on a little bit of some primary takeaways from all of this. So I guess finally one last slide. So I think one of the big things that is kind of obvious from this is that, we talk a lot about college as like you start college, you kind of progress through easily, but this idea of a direct path through college is actually not that common, particularly among Chicago public school graduates. And knowing that this is something that that there are a lot of different patterns of how things go. Another thing is I think there's a lot of, we sort of think about this pattern of going from a two-year college to a four-year college and as a pathway to a bachelor's degree. That's really not something that is happening for a whole lot of Chicago public school graduates. So only 1 in 5 of students who start off at a two-year college transfer to a four-year college within 6 years. Through surveys, we know that the vast majority of them did say that they ultimately wanted to get a bachelor's degree, but only 7% of them are actually completing a bachelor's degree. And I think there's a lot of work that is happening inside of Chicago to improve these numbers. So we are looking at numbers that are almost 10 years old, or the graduates from high school about 10 years old, but it's still a complicated path, and it's not something that we can assume that this is a clear way for students to attain a bachelor's degree. Another thing is about taking time off. So there are a lot of reasons why students take time off, and some of them are necessary, some of them are things, but when students leave, it really does change their likelihood of completing. Students are coming back to college, but the likelihood of completing college goes way, way down. Finally, this is actually something I didn't show directly, but I think right now this idea of like taking a gap year has become sort of common, or it's this big idea that is out there about what students might do. When we look at the students who don't start immediately into college, 90% of them are not completing a degree or a certificate within 6 years. And certainly, some of those students had no intention of ever going to college, but there are a lot of students, and we also see this from surveys that we've done of seniors in Chicago, that a lot of them do have ambitions of completing some form of college, whether it's a certificate, an associate degree, a bachelor's degree, or a graduate degree. And I will stop here, but I think a lot of this is just to demonstrate how, how important it is to really delve a lot more deeply into these patterns, and not just to be looking at kind of the outcomes, the kind of easy outcomes, but to really hear this. And I think one of the things that we've also would like to do more of is to really probe into the stories of like what is happening here and understanding what these experiences are like from the student's perspective. So thank you, everyone. And I'll turn it over to, I guess, Roneeta?
So Bob.
Or to Bob.
Yes,
Okay.
we have some questions for you, Jenny, both from the audience and myself. So I have two more technical data questions than one bigger question. So
Sure.
I saw from your chart, and I think you just didn't talk about it, but also it didn't seem to be the kids that went the other way from a 4-year institution to a 2-year institution. They also didn't seem to have high outcomes, if I follow your chart correctly.
No, no, that's true. I mean, I think, you sort of see that it's a lot more that like these students who are going from a 4 to a 2-year college, they're not, like, there are some of them that go back to a 4-year college, but for the most part, they aren't completing college, and only a really small number of them are completing a certificate or a degree at a 2-year college. And so, and I think a lot of what is also clear to me is that, how students are, they start in college, sometimes their plans don't work out. They see potentially, going to a 2-year college is a way of continuing to move toward a degree, but it's still, it's like, they just become a lot less, at least students are a lot less likely to complete a bachelor's degree than students who stayed in there. We've also been taking a look at kind of the reverse pathway for looking at degrees and see what those paths look like. For students who do complete a bachelor's degree, the vast majority of them are actually in that kind of blue block at the top of students who persisted in college throughout. So it's like they didn't take time off, they didn't move to a 2-year college, they just went through, which in some ways is logical. But on the other hand, the fact that so many students are ending up needing to take time off or finding themselves in, where their school isn't working for them and they're transferring to a 2-year college, it means that this is a really common, there are a lot of issues that students are confronting even when they are successful. They can transition to a 4-year college.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really informative that, the one broad takeaway, right, is that anything that interrupts momentum is really significant.
Right. No, exactly.
And that, that goes against some of those sort of romantic notions, right? That like, oh, kids are finding themselves. And it totally makes sense that some kids will go to a 4-year and say, no, I want to go get a 2-year technical degree, or I'm starting off at a 2-year. Now I can really do 4-year. I have confidence. And like that romantic narrative is like the exception, right? It's not the normative. The normative outcome if momentum gets interrupted. Whatever interrupted that momentum is significant enough that it interrupts the whole progression. It doesn't just interrupt you in one place at one time. So I just think
definitely. And
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is like, we've kind of seen this like in your work and work that I've done or work at the Consortium and a lot of other places, just how hard transitions are. And anytime students are having to make transitions, whether it's for different schools or different sectors or taking time off and having to come back, it's interrupting that momentum that they had, and that's particularly true in a place like Chicago, where a lot of these are first generation college students who don't necessarily have the same kind of resources, social connections, all these things that make it a lot easier, to maintain that momentum, but when it gets interrupted, to be able to return to college and kind of complete the credential that they had hoped to in the first place.
Yeah. And the other thing I just saw that was a little interesting too is that, and I know this was, there's a time lag here, but still, that the overall rates don't seem to be that far off national averages, right?
Right.
This group that tried to go to college, like 54% got a degree and 46 didn't. I mean, national averages is a little bit higher, but not like hugely higher. And so I just thought it was an interesting context.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, like the college enrollment rate for Chicago public schools, high school graduates is like, it's pretty much on par with national numbers, which is, really impressive for a district that serves, a a lot of low-income students, a lot of students who are first-generation college students, but there's been a lot of effort inside and outside of the district to place an emphasis on college going. And I think the other thing that is also important to note is that as college enrollment rates went up, college graduation rates have also gone up over time. So that's really good news. But I think the other thing that I always remember is that even as we're seeing thousands more college graduates coming out of Chicago each year, with the rising college enrollment rate and the college graduations not keeping pace, means there's a lot of students who started college and didn't complete. And quite often that also means that they had to take out loans or all these other things that could be happening with them when they don't have a degree or certificate in hand, even though they've invested the time and the money to try to complete college. So I think it's really trying to think what is happening here. I think we're sort of, with this report, we kind of are shedding light on what this looks like, but the why and what to do about it, I think, are the really important questions that get surfaced by this.
And just, Anne, I'm checking if we had any questions in the chat before we move on to Roneeta.
No
Okay.
questions in the chat.
Okay, so, and I can see Roneeta is dying to get in here because her findings dovetail so perfectly, almost like we planned. Let's turn to her now.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you, everyone. Pleased to be here with you all today. And I'm so excited to follow Jenny because I think some of the research I'm going to share with you today actually helps explain some of what is going on, even though it's a smaller qualitative study. It actually gets into the why of what's happening to students as they're transitioning. So I'm going to actually speak about two independent research studies that have examined the impact of the linked learning approach on students' post-secondary transitions. And I'm going to focus my remarks on the qualitative study I just mentioned, which looked at the post-secondary trajectories of 16 linked learning alumni. But I want to provide some highlights from the evaluation that I led when I was at SRI, because it examined quantitatively students' high school and post-secondary outcomes and sort of sets up the rationale for why we needed to look more deeply at what was happening to our students as they were transitioning. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the linked learning approach, linked learning students learn through career-themed pathways tied to local industry sectors. So these pathways can be structured as small learning communities within a larger high school, or as standalone small high schools themselves. And the majority of linked learning students come from low-income families. They're English learners, first-generation college goers, and generally part of a population that, as you all know, are vastly underrepresented in higher education and higher paying jobs. Each pathway has 4 essential components, which you see here on the screen. So their students have a rigorous academic program that prepares them for success in college. In California, that means students have access to the complete college preparatory sequence required to be eligible for 4-year public universities here in California. Students also take a sequence of career technical education courses that emphasize real-world applications of academic learning. They are also exposed to a continuum of work-based learning experiences that build their social capital and teach them the professional skills needed to thrive in a career. And then finally, they have access to comprehensive student support services that address their individual student needs. So as you see on the next slide, we actually invested in a rigorous independent evaluation from the beginning of this work. The work began in 2009 with 9 California school districts, and it was called the Linked Learning District Initiative. And the idea was to demonstrate the approach at a systemic level in all kinds of geographies, urban, rural, suburban. And SRI was brought on as the independent evaluator to see whether, if the approach was scaled, whether it would have an impact on student outcomes in those 9 districts. And you'll see that from what you see on the slide here, it really did have an impact. So students in certified linked learning pathways, those that have demonstrated a certain level of quality, were more likely than similar peers in traditional high schools to graduate from high school. They earned more credits towards graduation. They completed more college preparatory courses, and they reported developing more of the 21st century skills and socio-emotional learning skills necessary for post-secondary success. And these positive findings were particularly strong for students who entered high school with low levels of prior academic achievement based on their 8th grade standardized test scores. SRI also looked at students' post-secondary outcomes. And again, the data are particularly strong for students who are traditionally underrepresented in higher education. And so you see that students with low prior achievement were more likely to enroll in college after high school than similar peers. They're also more likely to enroll in a four-year as opposed to a two-year college. And then African-American linked learning students were also more likely to enroll in a four-year college. On the whole, SRI didn't find any negative effects of linked learning on post-secondary enrollment or persistence. Linked learning students were just as successful in preparing students for college as traditional programs. But that for us wasn't really good enough. We felt that given the upward trajectory of linked learning students as they were graduating from high school, we would expect that the students would not only start ahead, but actually remain ahead in their pursuit of a post-secondary degree or credential. And so these findings actually suggested to us that there needed to be greater attention on students' transition to and through post-secondary education. And so to understand SRI's findings more deeply, we commissioned the UCLA Center for Community Schooling to conduct a qualitative study to complement the multi-year evaluation, really illuminate the voices of linked learning alumni as they reflected on their high school and post-secondary experiences. And so they conducted in-depth interviews with 16 diverse linked learning high school graduates from the classes of 2014 and 15. And those were the same cohorts that were studied by SRI in their quantitative evaluation. And UCLA's findings, I think, really shed light on how students experience that transition to post-secondary education and careers, and how linked learning, their experiences in linked learning influenced their trajectories and also prepared them for life, but also they talked about some of the barriers they faced. And I think, Jenny, what you talked about in terms of the complicated pathways was very true of these 16 students. I think that slide that you showed with all the varied pathways applied to our 16 students in just the same way. Nobody had a straight path from high school to obtaining a degree. So, we had 16 students. 5 years after high school, 8 had obtained a bachelor's degree, 2 had obtained an associate's degree, 1 had obtained a certificate, and 5 were still pursuing a degree. And for none of those students was it a straight path from graduation to a four-year credential. So on the next slide, I think it's helpful to see sort of what their experiences were that both helped them, but also what else they needed to be able to be successful. And so I think what's really important to know is that the experiences that they were getting in high school really built, I think, a set of skills and competencies that really were powerful in preparing them for college. So they had opportunities to engage in interdisciplinary projects and demonstrate their learning in authentic ways through capstone research projects and through defenses of their portfolios. They had opportunities to be exposed to a range of careers within their industry sector, to professionals and tools and experiences, and really discover their sense of purpose. And they had a really supportive space to investigate their curiosities and develop a positive academic identity, because they were in a smaller academy with caring adults who really understood them as individuals with distinct interests, backgrounds, and life circumstances. So linked learning I think that experiences prepared them, but then they had these decisions to make about post-secondary and what to do. And so kind of going back to what Jenny was talking about, there's so many things that they have to consider when making their decisions about what to do after high school. And they specifically named the financial costs associated with post-secondary education, their own legal status, and their family obligations, as well as their own career interests and goals, as influencing their decision about their path after high school. They also relied on caring adults, such as teachers, counselors, mentors, and family members, to help them make sense of their options and provide guidance on these life-changing decisions. And it was interesting, they talked about the fact the high expectations held by staff members in their pathways help shape their decision-making. And this was around the idea that they should be pursuing something post-secondary, right? Some sort of post-secondary training or degree. And then finally, their sense of readiness also influenced their own decision-making. What was really interesting that for a couple of our alums, they actually felt like their post-secondary options felt somewhat limited, and they felt like they needed actually more time and space after high school graduation to discover their sense of purpose and explore their career interests. And so it's kind of this, Jenny, you mentioned the gap year actually means that a lot of kids don't end up completing college. So there's this, I think, a little bit of a tension where some people don't feel like they're really ready to make that leap to a 2 or 4 year college, but then they might not, actually then end up pursuing it if they don't go straight away. But I think they also felt like there was a real push for 4 year, and that they weren't given sort of information about the full range of post-secondary options, and wish they had been given, I think, a lot more information than they had. I think the push for in a lot of places was for going straight into a 4 year college. In terms of the advantages that they felt that they had once they were in post-secondary, they felt that that they had really developed public speaking, research, and writing skills through their projects and presentations learning that were useful to them in sort of navigating their academic courses. They also felt really confident in their ability to demonstrate professionalism and 21st century skills. They felt they were prepared to interact with and communicate with employers, and felt that the collaboration and critical thinking and problem solving skills that they had developed in their linked learning pathways were particularly useful as they were navigating new work environments. But in terms of the challenges that they faced within their post-secondary settings that I think really hampered their ability to navigate the transition, they mentioned a lack of access to supports and resources within those post-secondary learning environments. They felt alone in dealing with financial concerns, their immigration status, and family responsibilities. So they didn't really know who to go to in their post-secondary institutions to support them. And again, these students were, I think almost all of them were first-generation college goers. A few felt that they were able to reach out for assistance and create some supportive communities, but others really had to create alternative paths, and they weren't able to sort of, stay on the path to their original goals of completing a post-secondary credentials. And I would say that they felt like their challenges were exacerbated by a sense of both disconnectedness, where they felt alone, and they felt like they had to work really hard and independently to stay on track. And then also just a sense of that post-secondary had a culture of competitiveness that encouraged competition rather than collaboration and support, which was really different than what they'd experienced being in a linked learning pathway. I mean, that really, I think, eroded for some students their confidence and worked to discourage rather than encourage the development of their interests and talents and strengths. And so I think, for our students coming out of a linked learning pathway, their secondary and post-secondary experiences felt really siloed, with success in the one segment not really translating into success in the next. And so, for us, ultimately, it's really thinking about how we pay attention to that transition space and support students. UCLA on the next slide actually provides some recommendations for consideration around how to strengthen that post-secondary transition space. And I won't go into all of it, but it's all sort of detailed in the report, and happy to discuss it. But some of them are things that we can be doing better on the K-12 side. Some of these are things that can be done better on the post-secondary side. And I think ultimately, our feeling is that there needs to be just much more intentional collaboration and co-design work between K-12 and post-secondary to support these transitions. And especially now, Bob, you alluded to just the challenges right now, right? I mean, we know that college enrollment is way down, especially, and it's really being fueled at the community college level. How are we supporting these young people who, are really veering off the path at this important juncture? So I think hopefully the findings here and sort of the things that our students are experiencing help inform how we can have conversations about keeping kids on a path towards post-secondary success. And I'll stop there and open it up to questions.
Thank you. So I encourage folks to put their questions in the chat, and I'll start off. So really important and fascinating, and right, a very good, follow on to Jenny's, right, just trying a little bit of what's going on. And, what's really striking, right, is that linked learning, right, clear evidence of like a successful effort. We can always do better, but a successful effort to involve the preparation for post-secondary, and clear evidence that sort of worked. And yet they get to post-secondary, and it just shows you, as we've learned, you can't sort of inoculate, right? There's not an inoculation against the bumpiness of post-secondary in the moment of post-secondary. And it really speaks to the need, as you said. I really like the way you said, like, sort of and we really encourage this in the Pathways to Adult Success, this idea of post-secondary and K-12. It's sort of co-creating the transition in the space, but also the types of supports and just the experience. Why should it be so radically different, right? If if a set of things that work here, why does it, left a chance whether it's continued or not when you get to post-secondary? And
exactly.
And again, I'm sure most of those institutions would say, oh, but we have this student support and this student center, but it all depending on the kids to find their way there and to know about it, and not really having that proactive, it's built into the day-to-day, right? And then that's where it's easy to get lost in the cracks. And I just, that disconnectedness was so revealing, right? Because we know, that both during COVID and post, but the idea that, to be connected, you have to there's adults that know and care about you as a person, right? And they had that in high school, but not in college,
exactly.
Right? You need a supportive peer group. They had that in high school, less so in college, right? You need to believe what you're doing, matters. And maybe that's still there. And then, you have a sense of you're sort of welcome for who you are, right? And maybe that's not quite so much there, right? Because it's like, oh, I have to be competitive now. I can't be, So you could clearly see those core elements were sort of missing. And it's sort of, pretty essential that they're there is what this shows, right? You can't sort of bluff your way past it. Oh, they're young adults now. They can find their own way, right?
And I totally, Bob. And I think, I think our higher ed system isn't set up for first-gen students, right? It presumes that students know how to find those resources, right? They might be available, but students have to find them. And at the same time, they're navigating financial hardships. They're trying to figure out, how am I going to pay for this thing? I'm worried about my legal status. There's so many
family
things
responsibilities.
Yeah, there's so many things they're carrying. And so the idea that somehow they're going to also then find their way through this huge post-secondary institution with thousands of students seems crazy.
Right. And just, as we know too, that wasn't the data collective. It is that bumpiness that I thought I was prepared and then I get a bad grade. And how do I recover from that bad grade? And we've now worked for 20 years at the high school level to have supports for that bad grade.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have those at college, right? And some are doing it. It's not some are starting to, but as a general rule, it's not a normative feature yet.
Exactly. So it looks like there's a question in the chat. The UCLA study only followed 16 students in California. So they were either going into the California State University system, the four-year public university system, or into two-year colleges. And I'd have to look up, I can look up exactly where they all ended up. But it's interesting. 9 went to a full-time four-year institution, 3 went full-time community college, 2 went part-time community college and worked. 1 worked full-time and 1 went to technical school full-time, but all of their paths were all over the place. I think there might, if I recall, I'd have to go back and look at the UCLA findings. There might have been 1 or 2 students who went directly to 4-year who were able to complete within 4 years, but that was it out of the group of 16. Jenny, I don't know if you have other patterns that you guys were able to identify in yours.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We haven't divided it. We hadn't used that particular lens to understand the patterns. It's something that we're planning to look at in terms of completion rate. So we started a study to understand that. We'll probably do it more on an institutional level, but I think that's really it's a good question. I think the other thing that always comes up too is that the students who start at these colleges are also themselves really different. So thinking about the role that plays too, and the resources that are available for students at these different types of schools.
And I think, what's interesting, my guess is that it's going to partly also just be about the actual services and environments provided to kids. And that can happen in different types of, it's almost like a more institutionally than type of I think now, because I think of that, we know that we've in a Pathways to Adult Success, we've heard a lot about the great work done at Georgia State, which is a large state institution. Mm-hmm. And then we've also heard from National Louis University, which is a smaller private university in Chicago, which, for example, is trying to now get to a point where all college kids get an internship, right? And that's is a way to build that connection to careers and that meaning, right? And that's, so my guess is that we might, if we had a big enough data sample, tease out a few differences, but I think it's almost going to be about what the institution is doing. And at this current, where we're at, it's at any one of those, whether it's small liberal arts or large state or HBCUs or women's colleges or religious, like you'll find some doing it and some not. And that's probably going to be the more defining thing, is just the institutional level work. And and the folks that have done it have found it's a real iterative process. Like the first thing they thought worked wouldn't work. Like that you have to sort of keep figuring it out. So I do think that's, it's where the work is now, right? And we have, and the data is so stark, right? It's not like we're saying, 80% of kids make it and we have 20% of kids not. And that we need to do better, right? That's like 20% too many, right? We're showing that like, it's like on the order of half, right? Or, right, it's not, which really, points to the urgency ultimately of working this out.
And Bob, I would just add also, like, again, the cohorts that were the focus of the two studies were the classes of 2014 and 15. But in the interim, like, the Cal State University system in California has launched a huge graduation initiative 2025. They revamped a lot of their support services because they were seeing real issues in graduation and retention. Our community college system has adopted guided pathways. And so unfortunately, I don't think the students who are represented in these studies were the beneficiaries of some of those newer initiatives that have tried to attend to persistence and graduation. So it would be interesting to sort of see what happens, a few years out as those initiatives have sort of taken hold, to see if there are any improvements.
Yeah, and I mean, this also kind of reminds, like, we did a study just trying to see what happened to college enrollment and college retention rates during the pandemic. And then we are also kind of thinking like, oh, there might be certain types of schools that where students were less impacted by the pandemic in terms of their enrollment and retention. And we really didn't see any pattern, but what was interesting is that actually like for retention rates actually went up slightly in four-year colleges during the pandemic, which really kind of surprised us. But there were a few colleges, and they were all public universities in the state of Illinois, like Western Illinois, Northern Illinois, and Illinois State, that saw increases in their college enrollment and their college retention rates during the pandemic. And a lot of it was, we were kind of curious about this because there were pretty dramatic increases in enrollment and retention, and they sort of talked about how there were initiatives that they had been thinking about pre-pandemic that they were able to accelerate. And they really had a lot of intentional strategies around it, like going test line in terms of not just admissions, but also in terms of their merit-based financial aid, or things about not making owing money be a barrier to re-enrolling in the fall. So there's a lot of different strategies that we didn't do a study for them, so it's purely anecdotal. But there are a lot of things that policies that seems like certain institutions can take on that maybe could make a big difference in helping students to enroll and to ultimately complete college.
We got one question in the chat about the linked learning. If you have any sense of what are the high school things mattered the most?
It's interesting. It's so hard. When I was running the evaluation, people would sort of say, well, is it the work-based learning? Is it the integrated program of study? Is it the support structures? And we said, well, it's kind of the whole package, right? It's the whole pathway experience that brings all of that together. Like that's the intervention, right? That was studied. And it's all of those things coming together that made the difference for young people. I don't think any one of those things in isolation would have had the same impact, that all those things done well and at a high level of quality and rigor. That's what I think that's where you see the impact on students.
Yeah. And Anne has a comment that I want to see what you think about that. The arguments are made that, like, partly to help push better practices in higher ed, we have to have better information about their current state, both on, their actual cost and their graduation rates and their level of student supports. Sort of like you can take it all the way to sort of like an Amazon rating, right, of how successful kids are there on those different things. Thoughts on, is this like shining, shining light on the current state, is that going to push them to improve? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I guess it's, I mean, with that sort of thing, I think, like, if you'd asked me, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, I would have been highly skeptical. I mean, I think higher ed is like one of the it's really hard to see change, but I think, you know, with things like Georgia, you mentioned Georgia State and National Lewis, so I think we're starting to see like proof points where people are seeing how change is possible. So I think having this kind of transparency around graduation rates and you know, financial aid packages and all these different things, we're actually at a place where it's not just, there aren't just numbers, but there's actually some ideas about what practices may help move them. So I'm a lot more hopeful than I was before. And Roneeta, one thing you mentioned too is how a lot of colleges are not really designed for first generation college students. I think that's a tremendously important point, especially as like who is going to college is so different than it was 20 years ago. But I think another thing I think that's been really promising is just the recognition that, you know, who's going to college today is very different than it was before, and the needs that they have and these kind of basic things about, you know, having enough food or having a stable living arrangement, all these different things are not necessarily assumptions that colleges can make about their students. It has also been transformative with the way that colleges are thinking about their students, that they're not just there for the academics, but you actually need to be thinking about their broader situation, what actually enables them to be successful as students in college. And it sort of starts from just kind of basic human needs in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And Jenny and Bob, I wonder also, like, with this moment, with the declines in enrollment and the financial struggles that colleges are facing, whether it provides an opportunity for those that are really supporting young people to be able to lift up the programs and practices that they have in place to say, yeah, this is actually worth it for you to come here because you're actually going to get a great education and you're going to complete your degree in 4 years. Because I think there's a lot of questioning now about the value of that degree. So maybe the current moment provides an opportunity for folks to really reimagine how we can do better.
Yeah, we have a question from a friend and colleague from Uganda saying they have a similar challenge of kids not returning after the lockdown and declines in enrollments to post-secondary. And so I'm going to ask this more broadly to everywhere that it is, but right, we do know we're in this challenging moment, right, where there's both the actual barriers that we talk about, the family barriers, the financial barriers are higher, and add sort of the health barriers or just the grief and the trauma of you know, many of the highest needs communities where the death rates were the highest, where you're more likely to have a family member that died and maybe was a key, all family members are key, but maybe it was the family member that, you know, that drove the income of the family on top of that. And at the same moment, there are some employment opportunities that didn't exist before, and an agency that the kids get from, I survived the pandemic, I negotiated, I got out there, I didn't get sick, and I kept my family safe, and I earned money for us to keep paying our bills. I feel a lot of agency from that I didn't frankly feel just struggling in school, you know, and so just, I don't know, just more broadly, like, what is it going to require to, like, and I'll add one more factor, then I'll be quiet, is that, and in the relief plans, which is interesting, to their credit, they've told districts, you can use your federal relief dollars to go back to the class of 20 and 21 and help them out, even though they're no longer in your system, which is great, but very few schools are designed to do that. You know, they're not saying you can spend money on it, but it's like, it's just not in their wheelhouse to think, oh, I'm going to go find my,
how am I going to find them?
Years ago, you know? Yeah. Even if there's siblings, you could find them easier. But even if it was like the siblings of current students, it's not part of what they do, right? Or what they've done. So again, just any thoughts on what it's going to take in this moment to sort of rebuild some of these connections and create pathways back. I mean, we saw the key finding was you lose momentum, you're in trouble. Now we have a whole greater group of kids that have lost momentum. Any thoughts on how we can sort of reach out and build bridges for them or pathways to them back to post-secondary. And also all our audience should chime in here too. We should collectively figure this one out.
Jenny, did you have some thoughts you wanted to share?
Oh, I mean, I think it's a really big question. I mean, I think it's also, I mean, I think like on a whole variety of levels with the pandemic, people are sort of rethinking like the value proposition of education. And I think it's also been complicated, even for students who stayed connected, was, you know, they were still maybe enrolled, but the whole experience of doing remote learning also is a very different experience. And, you know, and there are a lot of competing things out there. So I think some of this is, I think colleges are going to have to do a lot more to sort of to demonstrate the value of it and with the experiences and why. So for some students to go back, other students it's very clear about why they would be there.
And I know I'd like to see our districts working more closely with their post-secondary partners. Most of our kids do not go that far away from home for college, right? They're usually going to the local community college or the local Cal State University, and our districts know that. And so like really trying to, you know, use those federal dollars to say, let's work together. Like these kids are all our kids. It's not like, oh, they graduated, so suddenly they're not our kids anymore. So I think just changing that mentality of like, they're our community's kids. And we need to make sure that they're actually going from one, you know, from our high school to your post-secondary institution succeeding and getting folks to think more as a community, as opposed to like, you know, we're done, we handed them off and whatever happens.
Right.
And that there are actually resources right now to do some of that work and deep thinking and collaboration.
And one thing that strikes me is that I think it's gonna be some like community level solutions just to build on that, one of the groups we featured in early in this year was Tacoma, where a bunch of nonprofits came together with their local universities to try to create both a way to make sure that all seniors had a place to go. And, you know, then you can extend that to the past couple of years seniors if you want, right? And then also creating ways for the local universities to all have similar policies and practices about when you could sign up, when deadlines got moved to, or you can then extend that to ways to sort of build pathways back. So building on your idea, I think it has to be the K-12 and higher working together, but also almost like a community level. Because to your point, most kids still go to college in the community. It also reminds me back of the early days of like our dropout prevention work. Like they drop out of school, but they stay in the community.
Yeah,
so, like,
exactly.
Really, everybody's interest to keep these pathways alive and keep momentum going where it's sort of lost, which I think is a key. All this research today has really driven home that the importance of momentum and the need to have strategies for when momentum is broken, that it's not the end, right? It's like there's ways, we need to build some ways that momentum can be restarted, because clearly for a large number of kids, especially underserved and first generation, it's a common experience for momentum to be blunted somewhere along the way.
And I think ultimately it's tied to a community's prosperity, right? You know, and whether that community, that region prospers because the young adults have a, purposeful path and jobs that are, that help drive the economy. So framing it as like, sort of the broader picture of community prosperity, I think is gonna be really important.
Yeah. And on that note, I'm gonna have to bring us to a close. Thank everybody today for a great session. We have a couple of upcoming events. One right tomorrow, America's Promise Alliance is releasing a new report on a survey they did of high school students in April. It's a very large national representative survey of where high school kids were in April. They're sort of releasing that and talking about some of the implications. Save the date, our past solution forums, we will be giving everybody, I think, needs a summer break and to try to, pivot from COVID to the future. We're giving you some space to do that. And we will be back here strong on September 14th for our next solutions forum for our Pathways to Adult Success learning community and all the other folks that have joined us. So I want to thank Jenny and Roneeta today for a great and insightful work on how to keep our kids going through post-secondary, which is just critical to, as he said, to all of our futures and our community's futures. And I thank everyone, and be well and onward. Take care.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.